Where do we start? The first thing you have to do is slow down. Start with the fundamentals if you don't have that under your belt. Start with this course. It's free on YouTube. It's CS50. It is taught by a Harvard professor. I've actually never watched these lectures, but a lot of people recommend this course. I have watched a lot of other lectures that were taught by this professor. He's incredible. He's a really good professor. Or what I personally recommend is that you enroll in an intro CS course at your local community college. So here's an example of an intro level CS course. If you take a look at the description, you'll see entry-level programming designed for students with no prior programming experience. So if you don't have the fundamentals, this is where you have to start. Okay, so this is what I like to call JavaScript fundamentals. First, pick VS Code and install ESLint and be done with it. Okay, so first we have to start with variables. You need to learn about the different data types in JavaScript. So we have to learn what primitives are. For example, like null, string, and number, and versus everything else, right? Which would be non-primitives, and these would be arrays, objects, and functions. You will also be learning how to declare variables, right? So you'll learn about var, let, and const. I personally would say ignore var for now and just focus on let and const, and then eventually at some point come back and learn about var, because you will see var in legacy code bases. So it's important to know how var functions. And you will also be learning about scoping rules, right? So function or globally scoped versus locally scoped variables. And so when you're learning this information, use the Mozilla Developer Network docs. They have really good documentation, and everything you can ever need or want to learn about, you can find it there. Okay, so once you're comfortable with this, once you understand this, the next thing to learn would be type coercion. This is where you will learn about truthy and falsy values, or put another way, forcing one value to be another value. So for example, if I have this variable is open and I pass it to our Boolean constructor, what will the output be? Will it be true or false? In this case, it's going to be true. And so from what I've seen, the only number that returns false when it's coerced using the Boolean constructor is 0. All of the numbers that you input will return true. Right, so this is important because JavaScript does a lot of implicit coercion for us under the hood, all the data types available to us. If you're not aware of this, you will have buggy ass code. Then you also want to learn about the difference between loose equality and strict equality. So in a nutshell, loose equality will implicitly coerce. So this expression will evaluate to true, and strict equality will not coerce. But more importantly, you need to know how these operators behave with primitives and non-primitives. And in a nutshell, you can think of this as comparison by value versus comparison by reference or pointers. Okay, so once you have that down and once you understand how that works, then you want to learn about control flow. And this is the reason, right? In our conditions, when we use variables, a lot of this implicit coercion will occur under the hood for us. And so this is where you run into a lot of bugs if you don't understand type coercion in JavaScript, right? So it is important to know about truthy and falsy values to avoid bugs when writing or learning control flow. And so this is why JavaScript can be a weird first language to learn. It just doesn't behave like other languages. Personally, if you don't have someone to guide you and you're learning your first language, JavaScript is a language that I don't recommend because of all this weird behavior that you don't see in other languages. When I was first learning JavaScript, the reason I was able to guide myself is because I came from a C++ background. So when I was writing C++, it was my first language. I mean, it was difficult, but what helped me a lot was the compiler, right? I would get all these random linting errors that I didn't understand, so I had to look them up. And along the way, I had guardrails. And with JavaScript, you can choose to disable those guardrails if you want and go crazy and just do a bunch of weird shit. So anyways, in general, you want to learn the default behavior when JavaScript applies type coercion to primitives and non-primitives. Okay, so the next thing you want to learn is functions. Simple as that. Right? So you want to learn how to declare functions in JavaScript. And this would be what I would call a normal function declaration or a function expression. And this type of function declaration, this is known as a anonymous function. So if you take a look at just this code right here, this function expression here, it has no name, hence the name anonymous function. But what we're doing is we're essentially storing that function in this variable. Aside from these technicalities, they are both functionally equivalent. To me, I see this as a stylistic choice. Unless you're using arrow functions, but ignore that for now. Right, and so here you'll be learning the differences between parameters and arguments. Right, so there's not much more I can say here. Okay, so the next thing you would want to learn about is, if you know object-oriented programming, learn ES6 classes. This is the modern way of creating classes in JavaScript. And for the most part, you want to avoid learning about ES6 when you're first learning JavaScript. And this is one exception. And before moving on, if you don't know object-oriented programming, I made a video on that. And so the reason why you want to learn ES6 classes first is because you will avoid a lot of the issues dealing with the this keyword in JavaScript. And here's a short snippet of the syntax for ES6 classes. And eventually you'll want to learn the old way of doing classes in JavaScript, and I'm actually currently working on that video as well. Okay, once you get past ES6 classes, right, and you want to learn all this material in the order that I'm listing it. But anyways, as I mentioned, you want to learn about the this keyword and how it can misbehave in JavaScript. If you're coming from an OOP language like C++ or Java, this does not behave as you would expect in JavaScript. And for this reason, learn about this after learning about ES6 classes. Why? Because when using ES6 classes, this behaves as expected. When you know the expected behavior, it's easier to learn about how this misbehaves in JavaScript. And here's a resource that I'll make sure to link down below in the description. And you can start with chapter 1. And before I forget, the author of this book, he's actually working on new editions, but the older editions are still useful. So you can start with chapter 1, but this whole book talks about how the this keyword misbehaves in JavaScript. So by the time you get here, you will already have experience working with the this keyword in the context of ES6 classes. And here's a link to the new editions. The author has completed about, I think, 2 out of the 5 or 6 books. So by this point, you should have a decent grasp on JavaScript. Okay, so what's next? Now you're ready for ES6. Well, sort of. It's time to what I like to refer as to filling in the gaps. Not really filling in the gaps, but more being exposed to the modern way of doing things in JavaScript. And before learning ES6, you need to learn base JavaScript, which is everything that I've introduced in the previous slides, with the exception of const, let, and ES6 classes. So I've been gradually introducing ES6 features because modern JavaScript or ES6 has a lot of features, and it doesn't make sense for you to just sit there and learn everything from top to bottom. You want to learn this incrementally. Okay, so by the time you get here, you want to start with ES6 control flow. So at this point, you should already know what I like to refer to as base JavaScript control flow. And this is how you want to learn ES6 features, right? With a few exceptions here and there, obviously. But now that you know about base control flow in JavaScript, it's easy to add on top of this, right? It's easy to learn ES6 control flow. It's easy to learn about the modern ways of doing control flow in JavaScript. And then you want to learn about ES6 arrow functions. And by this point, you should already know how the this keyword can misbehave in JavaScript, which is one of the reasons why ES6 arrow functions were introduced. So, if you know how the this keyword can misbehave, then learning arrow functions should be straightforward. Okay, so after learning a little bit more of ES6, what's next? And so the topics that I will list on this slide, you can learn them in any order you want, right? And as I mentioned, at some point you want to learn how to create classes without ES6 classes, or the old way of creating classes. And this should be done after you learn ES6 classes and after you learn how this can misbehave. And so this will teach you about prototypal inheritance and the prototype change, or how JavaScript uses objects to implement inheritance. Then you want to learn about closures. And here you learn about the lexical environment. And in a nutshell is functions bundled together with its surrounding state. Then you want to learn about the global execution context. So this is the big picture. This is how JavaScript gets executed. And I actually made a video on this, and I'll make sure to link that as well. And then you also want to make sure to learn TypeScript. Right, and getting to this point, it's going to take some time and a lot of effort, but once you get here, it feels great. But there's always more to learn. You want to learn about the DOM, right? The document object model, the DOM API to interact with the DOM elements. You want to learn about DOM events. You also want to learn about asynchronous JavaScript. So this is where you will learn about ES6 promises, async await. You also want to learn about the different web APIs. Specifically, you want to learn about the fetch API, which is promise based. And the fetch API is what we use to fetch data. At some point, you will also want to learn about the event loop. So at a high level, the event loop consists of the event loop itself, a call stack, the micro task queue, and the task queue. And at some point, you want to start looking into some more advanced topics, which primarily deal with performance. You want to learn about the critical rendering path. You want to learn about garbage collection, right? Minor and major GCs in JavaScript. You want to learn about layout thrashing. And at this stage in my career, this is where I'm spending most of my time. I'm learning more about the critical rendering path, garbage collection, layout thrashing. This is the life of a developer, right? The learning never stops. There's always something new to learn. There's always room for improvement, right? And so this is the reality of being a front-end engineer or just a software developer in general. You're always learning and growing, or at least you should be. Anyways, thanks for watching, and if you found this useful, please like and subscribe, and if you have any questions, make sure to leave them down below in the comments and I'll do my best to answer them.